Hi, this is Shreng Siddharth and welcome to this tutorial video where we will dive into and explore what is Activity Lifecycle. Well, from the basics of Android, we know there are four application components found in Android. Activity is one of them. Very similar to each application component, Activity has its own lifecycle, which defines how the activity is being created and how it is being destroyed. So, in between creation and destruction of an activity exists the life cycle of the activity. So, let us understand activity life cycle with an example. Suppose this is an email list activity. Well, of course, we know that each screen that appears in front of us represents one activity, right? Now on click of this compose button, we navigate to the compose email activity. Let us assume that. So altogether we have two activities in front of us. So how does activity lifecycle methods gets executed behind the scene? What happens to the previous activity when we navigate from here to here? Let's together understand it. So as soon as you open an application, the first activity starts to get created, which is marked by the execution of onCreate method. I'm sure if you have ever worked in Android, this method is by default present in your main activity. But at this point, the UI of this activity is not yet visible to the user. So within onCreate method, we generally decide the UI of the activity and initialize few properties and variables. Now soon after this, onStart method gets executed. With execution of this method, the activity gets visible to the user. But this does not mean the activity is ready for user interaction. So right after onStart, onResume method is executed. And with execution of this method, the activity is now ready to use. So you can now scroll the page, read any message or do whatever you like to. Right now I am going to click on this compose button, which will again initiate the navigation to our next activity, which we saw previously. But, it doesn't perform navigation so quickly. You need to go through a life cycle process in order to open a new activity. This is how Android works. So before this activity comes to foreground, the old activity needs to go to the background, right? So as soon as this button is clicked, onPause method is executed for this old activity. And right after this, onCreate method gets executed for the new activity, which initiates the creation of this new activity. So after onCreate comes the onStart method, where our activity just gets visible to the user but not yet ready for user interaction. So within a blink of eye, onResume is executed, which makes this activity ready for user interaction. Perfect. So with this, onStop method gets executed in the previous activity. So this sends this activity to the background and the activity is no longer visible to the user because currently this activity is in foreground and visible to the user. Now moving forward, what happens when you try navigating back from this screen to your previous screen? Well, in that case, onPause gets executed over here, followed by this onRestart method gets executed for our previous activity, which is about to come in foreground. So our old screen starts to resume itself by executing onRestart, then onStart, which makes this screen visible, and finally onResume method. So the user can start interacting with this screen. But before all this happens, the compose email activity begins to destroy itself simultaneously by executing onStop method, which removes this activity from foreground, and finally onDestroy method is executed, which completely destroy this activity. Fine. So now same thing will happen when you try to navigate back from this activity, When you do that, onPause method gets executed, followed by onStop, which removes activity from foreground, and finally onDestroy gets executed, which marks the end of this activity screen as well. So this is how a typical activity lifecycle looks like in day-to-day use of any Android application. Okay, we have seen the activity lifecycle methods. So what are the actual benefits of having these methods? We will explore that at the end of this video, so please don't worry about it. For now, let's verify the activity lifecycle behavior in our Android Studio. So I will now open Android Studio and create a new project with an empty compose activity. Add the following details. For simplicity, use the same package name as I have used here, just to avoid any conflict. While our project is being created, go to the URL being shown on screen and download these gist files. Just add and update these two files in your project, and also make sure to update the manifest file by adding this code. So if you run the application right now, we get a simple activity that navigates to next screen. So nothing great so far. So let's verify the activity lifecycle behavior. For that, in each activity class, I have added a string tag here and over here. Now, all the lifecycle methods which we just saw in slides are actually present within the parent activity class. And from parent activity class, we already have overridden onCreate methods by default, which is just like an entry point into your activity. So to observe the lifecycle, I will add a log statement like this. Next, I will override onStart method and add a log statement. In similar way, I will override rest of the lifecycle methods. And accordingly, I have added log statements in each one of them. Perfect. Next, if you go to the second activity, you will find we already have overridden all the lifecycle callbacks over here, such as from onCreate to onStart till onDestroy. So it's time to run the application and observe the lifecycle execution. So here within the LogCat, I have added the required filters to get a cleaner output. So as soon as the app opens, the onCreate, onStart and onResume method gets executed within the main activity. So let's move to the second activity. Bingo! The main activity gets into the pause state, and the second activity starts to create itself, and hence starts to come to the foreground, which means main activity loses its focus and enters into stopped phase. So from the second activity, if you try to move back, then you will find the second activity starts to lose its focus, and the main activity restarts itself by calling onRestart method, followed by onStart and onResume methods. And soon after this, since we no longer need the second activity, so it automatically gets stopped and destroyed from memory. Fine, so I hope it makes sense now why all these are getting executed. Next, if you press back again from this main activity, you will find onPause and onStop gets executed for this activity. But yet, onDestroy method is not executed. Now this is because in latest Android versions and with evolution of device hardware, the app gets minimized by default. So if you go to the recent apps, you will find your application is still present here, that is in minimized state, which means it is not yet destroyed. So if you open your application again, it will try to restart itself. That is, it is not being created from scratch. It is just getting restarted. So if you try to remove your application, even from the recent apps like this. Then you will find onDestroy being executed, which marks the end of your main activity. Fine. So this is how a typical life cycle of an activity looks like. Now at this point of time, I will give you a code challenge. Not exactly a code challenge, but an exercise. What happens to your activity when you change the screen orientation? That is from portrait to landscape and vice versa. This is something you need to observe yourself by looking at your LogCat. Take it as an exercise and I will definitely discuss its solution maybe in the next video. But before that, as promised, let's get a sneak peek of various lifecycle methods and their significance. So to summarize, onCreate method is executed only once when the system creates the activity for the first time. Remember, only once. So within this method, we usually initialize essential properties, values, and even define the UI. Then comes onStart method, which gets executed either after execution of onCreate or execution of onRestart methods. Here, the activity just gets visible to the user. So you may use this method to initialize code that updates the UI. Next is the onResume method, which is of course executed before the activity actually comes to the foreground and becomes available for the user interaction. Next we have onPause method, which when executed is an indication that we are moving away from our activity. So the activity starts to lose the focus. But technically speaking, at this point, it is still visible to the user. So within this method, you may choose to release some system resources. Next, within onStop method, which is executed when activity is totally out of screen, you may choose to release resources either related to Android system or even related to user interface. Because why to hold any resource which is no longer being used, right? Next we have onDestroy method, which marks the end of your activity. Last but not least, onRestart method is executed when the activity tries to restart itself and therefore tries to restore its previous state. Fine. So in short, while building any application, just keep one thing in mind. Within the methods at the top, including onRestart, you can add code which will help you to create your activity. And within these three methods, you can add code to release resources which can optimize your application performance. So yes, that's all for this video. This is Shreng Siddharth signing off. Thanks for watching and have a great day.